Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah, and we will be learning today Im Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Kuf Nun Zayin Amid Beis. We pick up on the bottom of Kuf Nun Zayin, well, 2 lines off the bottom of Kuf Nun Zayin Amid Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tafresh Tzadik Aleph Sif Beis, where we are continuing to discuss the actual writing and preparation of the Megillah. Says the Mechaber, we learned yesterday that the Megillah has to be written on klaf, and we had this whole discussion about gvil and klaf and dursustis. Now says the Mechaber, Haisa Kisuva al Haniyor. Let's say you actually wrote the Megillah on paper. So instead of using parchment, you used paper. Oy al or she'enoi ma'ubed. Or you used a hide, but it was a hide that was not prepared properly. It was not tanned. Oy shekisava kuti, or it was written by a non-Jew. Oy apikaris, or it was written by a Yid who chas v'shalom was an apikaris, a kaifer, a heretic. Pesula, in that case, the Megillah is puzzle. Continues the Mechaber, v'dina ki Sefer Torah. The halacha of the Megillah is akin to the halacha of a Sefer Torah. Le'inyan hekif gevil, in the context of the following halachas in the writing, says the Mechaber. The first one is le'inyan hekif gevil. The letters of the Megillah have to be surrounded by blank parchment. Now, when the Mechaber uses the word gevil over here, he's not using gevil as a technical term, the way we used gevil yesterday. Here he's using gevil as a generic term referring to parchment. The halacha of hekif gevil is that every letter in a Sefer Torah, and by extension, says the Mechaber, every letter of the Megillah has to be completely surrounded by blank parchment. So, if you take a letter and you touch it to another letter, then part of both of those letters is no longer surrounded by blank parchment. That would be a problem. That would be a psul. Another case, if you write a letter all the way up against the side, the end of the Megillah, right? So it's written all the way up against the edge of the parchment. Now there's no blank parchment on the side, on that side of the letter. So that would also be a chesaron of mukav gvil. That letter is not mukav gvil, and therefore it would be puzzle. So again, the Mechaber says, V'dina ki Sefer Torah, the halacha of the writing of the Megillah is the same as the halachas of writing a Sefer Torah. Le'inyan, in the context of the following halachas, hekif gevil, v'chatoitros chesed. And when it comes to the hump of a ches. What is the hump of a ches? So here, interestingly enough, we have a machlokes rishonim. We know that a ches in the Sefer Torah, we paskin that it is comprised of 2 letters. It's either a double vav or a vav and a zayin, and the 2 letters are joined at the top with a gag. They have a little peaked roof going from the top of one letter to the other. Some rishonim learn that is the chatoteres, the hump of the ches, is a reference to that peaked gag, that peaked roof at the top in the middle of the ches. Rashi Shita is that a ches, I have my Megillah here, I brought it here for something else. You can't see it so clearly, it's not going to come out so clear on the camera. But the ches, the left side of the ches has a line jutting up off of the end of the left-hand vav or zayin, be that as it may. It has a little a strechel, it's sort of similar to a tag to the crowns that we make, but it's one line. It's not 3 lines, but there's a line jutting up. According to Rashi, that is the hump of the ches, and the Mechaber is teaching us here that the same way the ches in the Sefer Torah has to have that hump, so too the ches in the Megillah has to have that hump. Continues the Mechaber, another halacha, utlias haheyin v'kufin, the hanging parts of the hay and the kuf. Both the hay and the kuf have a leg that is not attached to the rest of the letter, so it's hanging. Teaches us the Mechaber that the leg, the isolated leg of the hay and the bottom leg of the kuf, they cannot be touching the body of the letter in any way. They have to be hanging. V'chol gufais ha'oisiyos b'tzirasan. Also, we have the same halachas in the Megillah as we do in the Sefer Torah when it comes to the formation and the writing of any of the oisiyos of the Megillah. Ubachaseros v'yaseros. And so too, when we write the Megillah, we have to write the words properly in the context of chaseros and yaseros. That's extra lacking letters or extra letters. We know that we have words that could be spelled with a vav or without a vav. So if the letter is supposed to be a yasera, if it's supposed to have a vav, it needs to have it. If it's supposed to be chasar, so then it has to be missing that letter. So we have to be makbid on all of these halachas when it comes to a Megillah, the same way we have to be makbid when it comes to a Sefer Torah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, bottom of Kufdan Zayin Amud Aleph, Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Ches Le'inyan Hekif Gevil, the halacha that the letters have to be surrounded by blank parchment. Al Kol Ois, every single letter has to be Mukaf Gevil. V'hu Adin L'Chol Davar. Now the Chavetz Chaim makes a blanket statement, and he says V'hu Adin L'Chol Davar. When it comes to all of the halachas of the writing of the Megillah, we have to mirror the halachas of the writing of a Sefer Torah. V'lachein, and therefore, based on that, the Chavetz Chaim mentions a couple of other halachas. First of all, Be'inan shiyu shitaiseha shavim. We need that the columns and the lines of the Megillah have to be even. What that means is, if you take a look at my Megillah here, let's see if we can get it onto the camera. Yes, indeed we can. You'll see that every column of the Megillah, pick that up like that so you can see it better. Every column is even. It has margins on each side of the column, and no letters extend beyond the margin. That's a halacha of a Sefer Torah. When you write a Sefer Torah, the margins have to be even. Can't have anything protruding. Now, b'diavad, it happens to be, you can have up to 3 letters protruding beyond the margin, but that's only b'diavad. Lechatchila, it's supposed to be nice and clean, nice and straight. So too by a Megillah, the shitais have to be shavim, the columns have to be aligned properly. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, Gamishi roichav ha'amud, the width of each column is specific. It is a specific width. Gam roichav ha'amud, the width of the amud is supposed to be shalosh lemishpachai seichem. It's supposed to be equivalent to the word lemishpachai seichem written 3 times. Now, the word lemishpachai seichem is spelled with 10 letters, so lemishpachai seichem 3 times would be 30 letters. So the width of a column is supposed to be not less than 30 letters. What is it about that width that is significant? So for the Gemara in Menachos, it comes out that we don't want the amud to be too narrow, because if the amud is too narrow, now it no longer looks like a sefer, now it looks like an igeris. Now it looks like a letter. Okay, we'll get to that in another minute. And if you make the column too wide, we know that when you read something that has very wide columns, when you have to go from one line and then skip down and go to the beginning of the next line, sometimes the eyes could get confused. In the lashon of the Rishonim, ha'enos b'shaitatos, the eyes tend to float, meaning it's hard to follow the line clearly back to the beginning of a line, and therefore the Baal Koreh might stumble in the reading and accidentally miss a line. So therefore, the amud has a prescribed size. It's supposed to be 30 letters wide. Now, when I first learned this halacha over here, it threw me for a loop, because what did I just say? I said that we don't want the columns to be too narrow, because if the columns are too narrow, then the Megillah appears like an igeris. It appears like a letter as opposed to a sefer. Now, what's interesting about that is we know that in the pasuk, the Megillah is actually called an igeris. Igeris apurim azois. It's called an igeris. not only is the Megillah called an Igeris in the letter, but we already learned several halachas where the halacha follows the fact that the Megillah is called an Igeris. For example, we said that the Bal Kaira Lechatchila is not supposed to pause in the Kriya more than Kidei Nishima. You finish a pasuk, you could pause the amount of time it takes to take a breath, and then you're supposed to go weiter. B'di'evet, it's okay if you paused, but Lechatchila you're not supposed to pause. Why aren't you supposed to pause? Because the Megillah is an Igeris, and when you read an Igeris, you don't take breaks in the middle of reading a letter. You open up a letter, you read the letter. You don't often see people open up a letter, start reading, put it down, pick it up again, put it down, pick it up again. You read a letter, generally speaking, you read it in one shot, and therefore the Megillah has to be read in one shot. Another halacha, we learned that when we lane the Megillah, we do something very interesting. We open up the whole Megillah, and then we have this complicated way of folding the Megillah. Why? Because it's an Igeris. So why is it that suddenly now we have a problem treating the Megillah like an Igeris? We can't write narrow columns because then it looks like an Igeris. I actually wrote on the side of my Mishnah Berurah over here, I wrote Ksas Koshali. This is very shver to me. V'haloi ha-Megillah nikreis Igeris. The Megillah is called an Igeris. V'anu makpidim l'koif like Igeris. We're makpid to fold it like an Igeris. So this kasha was bothering me. Then I saw a Shari Tshuva, but we'll get to the Shari Tshuva in a minute. First, let's just finish Ois Kat Neches here. So the Gam Shi'aroich Hava Amid Shalish L'Mishpachai Seichem, and then the Mishnah Berurah finishes off the Ois Katan by saying V'chol Dinei Sefer Torah. So too, all of the halachas that apply to a Sefer Torah apply to a Megillah. Now that's a very broad statement. So let's take a look at the Dirshu footnote number 13. He brings up a very interesting halacha. When I saw this Dirshu footnote, it was one of the footnotes that I looked at, and I was like, okay, like they wrote the footnote just because they needed to write a footnote. It didn't seem to be such a pertinent footnote to me. But it's this footnote that led me to the answer to my question. So I thank you, Dirshu, for leading me along the way to answer my question. What does the footnote say here? We know that there's a halacha, you're not allowed to touch a Sefer Torah with your bare hands. Those of us who are learning Mishnah Berurah, we had the Gemara not all that long ago, that somebody, Gemara near the end of Megillah, if you touch the Sefer Torah Arum, if you touch the Sefer Torah with your bare hands, and the Sefer Torah is bare, Nikbar Arum, that person is buried Arum. The Gemara asked, what? Nikbar Arum Sakadaitach. And the Gemara says, Arum me oisai mitzvah. He doesn't get the schar from that kriya, from the Sefer Torah, if he was holding the Sefer Torah Arum. It says here in the footnote, are you allowed to touch the klaf of the Sefer Torah, like, of the Megillah, like I just did, right? I handled the Megillah with my hands. Are you allowed to touch the klaf of the Megillah? Is that a problem? Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to touch the klaf with bare hands. So is that a problem by the Megillah? After all, the Mishnah Berurah said, V'chol dinei Sefer Torah. So he brings down here Kasav La'el. It's written earlier in Hilchos Megillah HaTorah, Siman Kuf Mem Zayin Sif Katan Dalid, Bebir Divrei HaRamasham, Sheyesh Oisrim. There are those who do aser touching the Megillah. Ach minig ha'olam lahakal bazeh, but the minig of the Welt is to be mekel. V'toiv lahachmer, but it would be good to be machmer. Shaloilin gaya beklaf, that you should not touch the klaf of the Megillah. Ela la'achar the tilas yadayim. You should at least wash the tilas yadayim first. Shema naga b'mokaim matunif, because you don't want to touch the Megillah with unclean hands. You might have touched a part of your body, a mokaim matunif, and then it's improper to touch the Megillah with bare hands, and therefore you should wash your hands before you touch the klaf of the Megillah. And now comes the punchline in the footnote that led me to the answer to my question. He says, Ure'ei gam shari tshuva kan. He sends us to the shari tshuva kan, sif katan dalit. Okay, I was curious what it says here in the shari tshuva. So I started looking through the shari tshuva, and what I stumbled upon in the shari tshuva, here on Kufdun Zayin Amid Beis, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down in my print in the Shari Tshuva, the Shari Tshuva says as follows: Ve'ein nizharim klal milikach ha-Megillah b'lo mitpachas. We are not nizhar, not to touch the Megillah without a covering. You can touch the Megillah with bare hands, says the Shari Tshuva. V'hainu kipshitos divrei hashas. This is what flows out of a simple reading of the Gemara that we have. De le'inyan zeh amrinan kevan de nikreis igeres. Why is it okay to touch the Megillah with bare hands? Because the Megillah is called an igeres. B'lo mitpachas sagila. Since it's called an igeres, a letter, not a sefer, it does not have to have a mitpachas. Va'afagav de nikreis sefer. Even though we do find that it's also called a sefer, hainu le'inyan ad-devarim shehem hechsher aksiva. This that we find that the Megillah is referred to as a sefer, we use that to give us the halachas of the ksiva of the Sefer Torah. Kigoin sirtut, we saw yesterday, the Megillah requires sirtut. We have to engrave lines on the Megillah. Why? Because it's called a sefer. So it's like a Sefer Torah. The heck of Gvil, we learned today, the letters have to be surrounded by bare cloth. Why? Because it's a sefer. So we treat it like a sefer. Those are all halachas that pertain to the preparation and the writing of the Megillah. In that context, we follow the fact that the Megillah is referred to as a sefer. Avol b'dvarim she'achar haksiva. But in the context of any halachas that pertain after the writing of the Megillah, so let's say the laning of the Megillah, ki igeres dami. That's when we treat the Megillah like an igeres. And therefore, we lane the Megillah, we fold it like an igeres. That's after the ksiva is completed. The Baal Koreh cannot pause in the middle because he has to lane it like an igeres. So for anything that comes la'achar ksiva, says the Shari Tshuva, the Megillah is an igeres. Anything that comes before the ksiva, the preparation, it's a sefer. And that's why the columns can't be too narrow, because that would be writing it like an igeres, not like a sefer. V'afagav shebetama hayodayim, even though the halach is that it is betama yodayim, nitelas aruma k'may tefillin, you can handle it with bare hands the same way you can handle the parshas of tefillin with bare hands. So again, thank you to the Dirshu. That Dirshu footnote that discussed the halacha of handling the Megillah with bare hands led me to discover this Shari Tshuva that tells us when we treat the Megillah like a sefer, when we treat it like an igeres, and an answer to a question that bothered me for a long time. Okay, now we go weiter. Top line, Kuftun Zayin Amud Beis, the words of the Ramah. Hago. Gam, furthermore, Tzarech lekasva min haksav. When a sefer writes a Megillah, he has to write the Megillah in the same way that he writes a Sefer Torah, which is that he has to write it min haksav. You have to have a written Megillah in front of you. You read from the written Megillah, and then you write over into the new Megillah. Further, says the Ramah, Ulahoitzi kol teva mipiv kaidem sheyichtevena. You have to enunciate each word before you write it. So you look at the Megillah, and you go, Vayehi, Vayehi, Bimei, Bimei. So you have to look at the written in the kosher Megillah. You have to enunciate the word, and then you write it in the new Megillah. Kemai b'Sefer Torah, the same way that we write a Sefer Torah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut tes. Min haksav. We have to write the Megillah min haksav. We have to transcribe it over from an existing written Megillah. For hu hadin, the same halacha applies. Im echad makri oisai ba'al peh. So the Mishnah Berurah tells us here, really, this is lav dafka. You don't really have to write the Megillah by looking in a written Megillah first and then writing it to the new Megillah. You could have somebody next to you who reads to you. You don't have to look in the written Megillah. That person could look in the written Megillah and he could tell you Vayehi, and then you write Vayehi. So you never looked in the written Megillah. You just heard it from somebody else who did. So if somebody reads it to you, Kidei shelo yiteh. I just want to check quickly I didn't realize there's another possible way to learn what I just read, and I want to make sure that I did it accurately. See, I'm saying that what the Chavetz Chaim is telling me here is that somebody else could read the Megillah to you from a written Megillah, and you could hear it from him and then write it based on what you heard from him. But is that accurate? Does he also have to read it from a Megillah? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't learn it the other way, because then why would it be a Maila that he's saying it? He's also saying it Balpeh. So again, what the Chavetz Chaim says is, the Ramah said that you have to read it from a Megillah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, not necessarily do you have to read it from a Megillah. You could have somebody else reading to you from a Megillah, and then you write the Megillah Balpeh. And this is all Kidei Shelo Yiteh. This is all levels of protection so that you should not make a mistake when you're writing the Megillah. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, and we're going to see a Biur Halacha on this. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'hem avar v'kasav Balpeh. If you transgressed this halacha and you actually wrote the Megillah Balpeh, so you know the Megillah by heart, you have laid the Megillah many times, you sit down to write a Megillah, Vayihi b'meach Hashverosh shuach Hashverosh hamelech behodu vad kush sheva asir b'mei Medina, and you never looked in a Megillah. So v'hem avar v'kasav Balpeh shaloi min aksav, says the Chavetz Chaim, and he brings this down from the Darkei Moshe in the name of the Ran. So this is a Ramah in the Darkei Moshe on the Torah, and he's quoting a Ran. So Yesh Oimrim da'asa likrais ba ela b'shas adchak. You wrote a Megillah Balpeh. You wrote a Megillah without looking into another Megillah before you wrote it. The Darkei Moshe writes in the name of the Ran that Megillah, you would not be allowed to use it, even b'di'eved, it would not be kosher unless it was a shas adchak. So shas adchak, you're stuck. It's the only Megillah you have, then you could use it. Okay, take a look here in the Biur Halacha. Biur Halacha Dibra Maschil, Gam Tzarech L'Kosov and Aksav, Ayin B'Mishnah Berurah. Chavetz Chaim says, take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, Masha Kasavdo L'Inyi Di'eved, where I wrote the halacha b'di'eved. And I wrote that the Darkei Moshe quotes the Ran, and he takes from the Ran that this is also even b'di'eved. If you have a Megillah that was written Balpeh, you should not use it, unless it's a real shas adchak. V'hu b'Darkei Moshe b'shem Ran. This can be found in the Darkei Moshe in the name of the Ran. Now, that gives us a very big problem. If the Darkei Moshe brings this down from the Ran, the Darkei Moshe is the Torah written on the Torah. Darkei Moshe is the Ramah written on the Torah and on the Beis Yosef. If the Ramah saw fit to bring down this Ran in the Darkei Moshe, why didn't the Ramah bring it down here? When the Ramah says over here, Gam tzarech l'kosva min aksav, why didn't he say, and if you did not write it min aksav, also likrais by? Why did he tell me that? For some reason, the Ramah saw fit to leave out the Ramah from his Hagah over here on the Mechaber. That's what's bothering the Chavetz Chaim here in this Biur Halacha. So explains the Chavetz Chaim. The reason that the Ramah did not bring down this Ran in his Hagah over here, Nira, it seems to me, Mishum Deloi Beriralei Davar Zeh, because this was not clear to the Ramah. And he was not clear on this Ran. He wasn't convinced that we should follow this Ran. Why? Because Urayasai bin HaYerushalmi Yesh Litchais Bipshitus. The Ran brings a raya from a Yerushalmi that a Megillah that was written Balpeh, also likrais ba. You're not allowed to use it. What's his raya? His raya is from a story that occurred with Reb Meir. It says that Reb Meir was traveling and he didn't have a Megillah. So what did he do? He took out a quill, he took out a piece of cloth, and he wrote a Megillah. Okay, but what it says in the Yerushalmi is he didn't just go ahead and write a Megillah. The Yerushalmi gives actually two explanations of what happened. The Yerushalmi says he wrote a Megillah. So the kasha in the Yerushalmi is, how can he write a Megillah? You can't use a Megillah that you wrote Balpeh. We just had this halacha, a Megillah that you write Balpeh, you're not allowed to use. So what do you mean Reb Meir was stuck, he took out a quill and he wrote a Megillah? You're not allowed to use that Megillah. That Megillah was written Baal Peh. So the Yerushalmi gives two terutzim. Let's see here in the Bir Halacha. The Yerushalmi gives us two answers to this question of how Rameir was allowed to write a Megillah and use it to be Yotze the Mitzvah. He didn't write it mitach aksav. He didn't have a Megillah. Echad, the first teretz that the Yerushalmi gives is Shasat Chak Shani. The first teretz is a very simple teretz. The Yerushalmi says, well, Rameir was stuck in a bind. He was traveling. He didn't have any other Megillah. Shasat Chak, he had a quill. He had a piece of cloth. He wrote a Megillah. Shasat Chak Shani. Even though it's usher to use a Megillah that was written Baal Peh, in a Shasat Chak, where you have nothing else, you could do it. That's the Yerushalmi's first teretz. But then the Yerushalmi has a second teretz. The Echad, the second teretz is, the Rebbe Meir Kosav Shnei Megillas. Rameir actually wrote two Megillas. What he did was, he wrote one Megillah Baal Peh, and then he read from that Megillah and wrote a second Megillah. So, the Rebbe Meir Kosav Shnei Megillas. He wrote two Megillas. V'harishayna, and the first one that he wrote, which he only wrote to be able to copy out of, ganaz, he hid the first Megillah. So get this, he was stuck in a bind. He needs a Megillah. He knows that you're not allowed to use a Megillah that was written Baal Peh. So he wrote a Megillah. Then he took that Megillah, read from that Megillah, and used it to write a second Megillah. Now the second Megillah was written mitach aksav. Okay, the second Megillah is kosher. He leaned from the second Megillah. He was Yotze the Mitzvah from the second Megillah. But what did he do with the first Megillah? He didn't give it to his Einikel. No, he took the first Megillah, ganaz. He hid the first Megillah. Oh, umida ganaz. From the fact that he hid it, shma mina, we have a raya. Da'afilu b'di'eved, even though that's b'di'eved, it was already written, right? That's what b'di'eved means, post facto. So he already wrote that Megillah, mitoch haksav. Now it's b'di'eved. Are you allowed to use it b'di'eved? No. Umida ganaz, from the fact that he hid it, shma mina, we see, da'afilu b'di'eved, even in a b'di'eved situation, meaning you have a Megillah that was written Baal Peh. So you have it already. Now it's b'di'eved, ein likreispa. You're not allowed to use it. So that was the Ran's Raya. So when the Mishnah Berurah said over here, in Ois Cut Tes, V'em Avar V'kasa Baal Peh Shalom and Aksav, Yesh Armim Da'asa Likreispa, that came from the Ran. What was the Ran's Raya? This story with Rameir. Because Rameir took the first Megillah that he wrote, and he hid it. Continues the Chavetz Chaim in the Bir Halacha, but he says, Aval Bavli tirates rak shasat chak shani. The Bavli doesn't have the second teretz that Rameir wrote two Megillas. The Bavli only has the first teretz, that shasat chak shani. So since it was a shasat chak, he wrote one Megillah, and he used that Megillah. V'nucha loymar b'pshitus, and we could very easily, based on the Bavli, say, the Shasat Chak hit the Rameir la'atzmei l'kasva. Since it was a Shasat Chak, Rameir was matir for himself to write a Megillah Baal Peh, v'likreispa lechatchila, and then to use it lechatchila to be Yotze the Mitzvah. V'shaloi b'Shasat Chak lo yohay matir la'atzmei. If it wasn't the Shasat Chak, he wouldn't have done that. He would have written a Megillah Baal Peh if it wasn't Shasat Chak. Achein b'di'eved efshet t'shari likreispa ve'in tzarich lignois. The Bavli doesn't say that after he wrote this Megillah and he used it in a Shasat Chak, he went ahead and he hid it. We don't know that he hid it. So, based on the Bavli, the Ran doesn't really have a raya. And therefore, explains the Chavetz Chaim, that's why the Ramah did not see fit to bring down this halacha of the Rans to say over here in the Ramah, here in the Mechaber, that b'di'eved, this is not kosher. So the Chavetz Chaim brought it down, but the Chavetz Chaim also wrote the Bir Halacha to explain to you that this Ran is not 100% mukhrach. Okay. Ois Cotton Yud. The Ramah said that we have to write the Megillah ben Aksav, and you have to enunciate every word before you write it. Ois Cotton Yud l'haitzi kol teva hainu lechatchila. That's only a requirement lechatchila. But ubedi'eved ein lahachmir im loy ta'a. B'di'evet, if you did not enunciate every word, and you wrote the Megillah that way, as long as you didn't make a mistake in the writing, b'di'evet, the Megillah will be kosher. And the Ramah wrote that this is Kamei b'Sefer Torah. This is the same halacha as by a Sefer Torah. Meaning that just like by a Sefer Torah, you have to enunciate every word before you write it, even if you're writing it mitoch haksav, so too by a Megillah, you need both protections. You have to write mitoch haksav, and you have to enunciate every word. Says the Dirshu footnote number 14. Why is it that you have to enunciate every word? Kasav la'el, again, we're sent back to Siman Lamed Beis, the halachas of the ksiva of tefillin, b'shem hamagid avrav el Rabbah, shekevet she'ein ha'teva shkuros befiv, since the words of the Megillah are not shkuros befiv, not everybody knows every pasuk of the Megillah by heart, yesh lachu sheba yiteh, we're more concerned with the possibility of making a mistake, and therefore we need every level of protection. Well, according to this, dafka b'sefer Torah uve Megillah tzarich la'itzi es ha'tevos mipiv. Therefore, this halacha would apply by a Sefer Torah, by a Megillah, where there are a lot of psukim that are not shkura b'viv. Shaharei lo motzi shi'ateva shkuras b'viv. Avol b'tfilin u'mezuzas. If we're dealing with a mezuzah, that's Kriya Shema. We're dealing with tefillin, it's Kriya Shema. These are parshas. A lot of people say these parshas every day as part of their chakras. Sha'atev shkuras b'viv, ein tzarich la'itzi and b'peh, in case of Aysa mitach haksav. Ach kasav shaharbe achreidim soivrim, shevachol oifet tzarich la'itzi satevi b'piv kaid b'shich tevena. Maybe many achreidim hold that you always have to enunciate every word, even by tefillin, even by mezuzahs. And this is why, here comes the main reason why I mentioned this footnote. As I'm reading the footnote, I realized I forgot why I even wanted to speak out this footnote. The punchline of this footnote, the critical piece of this footnote, comes now. Why do these achrayim say that you have to enunciate every word, even when you're writing a mezuzah or you're writing tefillin, which are psukim that are shkura b'fiv, that people are very fluent in? So why are we so concerned that you're going to make a mistake, that we say that the Sefer must enunciate every word? Get a load of this. Kikach hi mitzvahs ksivas stam. Because the enunciation of the word before you write it is an integral part of the mitzvah of writing stam. Sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzahs. Why? Kedei shetihiyeh kedushas hahevel hayotzes mipiv, so that the hevel tinoiko shel beis rabban, the speech that comes out of your mouth, the kedusha of the speech that comes out of your mouth, kishekorei kol teva v'teva, when you read the words, nimsheches al ha'oisios, that kedusha should be chal on the letters, when you write them on the klaf. The reason you need to say the words is because when the Sefer writes the words on the parchment, he needs to imbue them with kedusha. How do you imbue them with kedusha? By speaking them, by saying them. The enunciation of the words of tefillin, of mezuzah, of Sefer Torah, that imbues the writing with a kedusha. And we see a couple of things from this. First of all, you see the kedusha of Sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzahs. One of my rebbeim, Rav Gershon Weiss, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Vracha, the Menal, the Frierdiker Menal of Yeshiva Staten Island, I remember by a Achnasas Sefer Torah, he brought down from one of the Frierdiker Gedolim, I don't remember which one, who gave somebody an eitzah. Somebody was going for a very tricky meeting with somebody, and the gadol gave him an eitzah. He said, you're going for a meeting on a Monday. Have an aliyah. And when you have an aliyah, you need to look in the Sefer Torah, and you need to read the words of the Sefer Torah. Looking in the Sefer Torah and enunciating the words from the Sefer Torah will imbue you with Kedusha. And you'll take that Kedusha with you to the meeting that you're going to have. So this is not stam writing. There's Kedusha at play over here. Also, we've seen this in the Gemara in many places, that there's a special segula. If you want to have atzlacha in Torah, you have to say the words out loud when you read them. We saw recently in the daf that you're supposed to say the words with a nigun. There's Kedusha to those words. I don't know if we'll have time. There's a story I would like to tell you about this, but we'll see if we have time. We still have to finish the page. Nothing stops before the page. Okay. Now we go further in the Ramah. Near the end of the second line, says the Ramah, V'oisin kol parshiyoseha stumos. All of the parshas, we divide up the different parshas of the Megillah in the format of stumos, closed parshiyos. V'emasan psuchos, if you made them open parshiyos pesula, then the Megillah is puzzle. Okay, what does this mean? So we know that all Kisvei Kodesh that we have in Chumash, the Navi, the contents are divided up into parshiyos. I don't mean parshiyos as in Bereshis Noach Lech Lecha. That's not what I mean. I mean that the psukim are separated, and you'll see in a Chumash there's a samach, there's a pei. That's the end of a parsha. Samach stands for stuma, closed. A pei stands for psucha, open. What's the difference between a parsha stuma and a parsha psucha? So a parsha stuma means that when you get to the end of that pasuk, there's a gap in the writing of the Sefer Torah, and then we pick up again with the beginning of the next parsha. How big is that gap? That gap has to be at least 9 letters long. But the new parsha begins on the same line that the old parsha ended. So you don't skip a line. You don't skip to the next line. Not a new paragraph. It continues on the same line, just you have an opening, a blank space of at least 9 letters. A psucha, you have to skip to the next line. That's the difference between stumais and psuchais. And if you take a look at my Megillah right here, you'll see that the parshas of the Megillah are interrupted in the format of stumais. Right over here, everything is mirror image. That's why this is proving a little difficult for me, and I'm trying to line it up with the camera. Okay, so you can see over there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines off the bottom of the Megillah. You see the one parsha ends, V'chamasam el shachacha. The next parsha begins, Bayoim hahu. So we didn't skip a line. We just have an empty space. Now, that space happens to be more than 9 letters long. It's approximately 12 letters long, but that's not a problem. It could be longer. The point is that it's stuma. The next parsha begins on the same line. It's not psucha. We don't skip a line. And the reason for that, again, is because the Megillah is called an igeres, and in igeres, they typically did not skip lines. Eis cut and yud beis in the Mishnah Berurah, stumais de nikra igeres, eis cut and yud gimel, psuchais psula. If you write it psucha, then the Megillah is puzzle. But Chuvas Rabbi Moshe Minsim and Yud Beis didn't hey mefakve kalzeh. He disagrees with this, and the reason he disagrees is because he says the fact is that an igeres is often written in paragraphs as well. Therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says, it appears to me, we definitely can be saimach on this b'shasat chak if you have only a Megillah that was written with the parshas being psuchos. Okay, continues the Ramah. 4 lines down, beginning of the line. Ubedieved ein lifsal Megillah mishum chaseros v'yaseros. B'dieved, we don't passel Megillah if it's lacking certain letters or it has certain extra letters, like the vovs that are either supposed to be there or not supposed to be there. Why aren't we makbid b'dieved? Explains the Ramah. Because, like we learned earlier, as far as Siman Tzadik Gimel, you could skip whole words in the Megillah, and the Megillah is not puzzle up to half the Megillah. Continues. You know what? Let's do the Mishnah Berurah here, Ois Katan Yodalid, Ubediavad, Pirish Kvar Karaba, if you already leaned in the Megillah, and then you realized a problem with Chaseris V'Yaseris, you don't have to lean again. And if you don't have another Megillah, certainly you could use that Megillah even L'Chatchila. Continues the Mechaber, the Ramah. Nope, the Mechaber. We are now 5 lines down near the end of the line. Now, before I read this Mechaber, brief introduction. We know that a Sefer Torah has 2 Atzei Chaim, right? The beginning of the Sefer Torah is wrapped around a pole. The end of the Sefer Torah is wrapped around a pole. In days gone by, other Sifrei Kodesh, like Nevi'im, only had 1 Eitz Chaim. They had an Eitz Chaim in the beginning. Why does the Sefer Torah have 2 poles? The reason the Sefer Torah has 2 poles is because if you only have 1 pole, you need to close the Sefer completely every time you finish using it. You have to wrap the entire scroll around 1 pole. Now, a Sefer Torah is used every week. We don't want you to have to be goyel the Sefer Torah every week. We want you to be able to keep the Sefer Torah at the parsha of the week, or whichever kriya you need. So a Sefer Torah has to have 2 poles. Nevi'im weren't used on such a constant basis. Therefore, Chazal said a Navi can have only 1 pole. Doesn't need 2 poles. How about a Megillah? Does a Megillah get a pole or does it not get a pole? Does it get 1 pole, 2 poles, no poles? That's one question. Next question. If the Megillah is going to have 1 pole, where should it be? Should it be at the beginning or should it be at the end? Now, there's a svara to say that it should be in the beginning because we want that when you're ready to lay in the Megillah, you should be able to open it up and lay. So put the pole at the end of the Megillah. That way, when you close the Megillah and you wrap it around the pole, when you want to open the Megillah, it's open to the beginning. So that would be an argument for putting the pole at the end. But there's also an argument for putting the pole at the beginning. What's that argument? We're going to see that the Megillah has to have blank space. On one of the ends, it has to have blank space. Why? Because we want a length of blank cloth that's going to wrap around the Megillah as a layer of protection. We don't want that layer of protection to have words on it. Then that would also need protection. So we want blank cloth, whichever end of the Megillah is going to be rolled to, there has to be blank cloth to wrap around the Megillah. That would be an argument for putting the pole at the beginning of the Megillah. Why? Because the end of the Megillah is considered less significant than the beginning. So we want to have blank cloth at the end. The protective layer should be at the end, not at the beginning. So these are some of the questions that we're going to grapple with here. Says the Mechaber, 5 lines down, near the end of the line. Utzricha omud b'seifa. The Mechaber says, you need a pole. You need an Eitz Chaim. Where? At the end of the Megillah. The chalak, and then you need blank cloth, beroisha, at the front, at the beginning of the Megillah. Why? Kedei lahakifa by, to wrap around the Megillah for protection. So Mechaber, you need a pole. Where? At the end of the Megillah. And you roll the whole Megillah closed so that it's opened at the beginning, and you need blank cloth at the beginning to wrap around the Megillah. So says the Mechaber. V'yesh omrim, some say, shetzricha tagin, that the letters of the Megillah have to have crowns. V'yesh omrim, she'eina tzricha, some say that it doesn't have to have crowns. Haggah, says the Ramah, v'nagu l'taiga, our minig is that we do make crowns. Gam nagu shaloi lasis limud klal b'sofa. We don't have an amud, we don't have a pole at all, not in the beginning, not at the end. Comes out, by the way, why don't we have a pole, not at the beginning, not at the end? Because there's too many machloikesin, and we don't know where to put the pole, so we don't make a pole at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Tesvav. Gam nagu shaloi lasos, we don't make a pole. Avol cholak b'roisha manichin, but we do have to have blank cloth at the beginning of the Megillah, because our minig is to roll the Megillah all the way to the beginning, and we have to have blank cloth at the beginning to protect the Megillah. The goylo misayfer l'tchilasai, because when we roll it closed, we roll it from the end to the beginning. Ice cut tezayin klal, we don't have an amid at all. V'agra b'biyura mifakvek al zem ha'id. The Gra is not happy with this. The Gra felt that it should have at least one pole, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. I thought today was a short page, and not only am I going to finish the page, I'm going to go on to the next page. Funny. It's already 44 minutes, so we'll stop over here. And thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's for force, Parnasa, and Shidduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeichet to see the Bias Koel Tzedek, B'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.